But there's one speck of good news that emerged from this crisis, and that is the final and complete death of libertarianism on the right and on the left.
I'm sure most of you are aware of the situation in East Palestine, Ohio right now. Just in case you're not, a freight train operated by the company Norfolk Southern Railway Corporation derailed in the eastern Ohio town. The train was carrying toxic chemicals, most of which I cannot easily pronounce, but human contact with them can cause a wide range of symptoms from skin irritation to a rare form of liver cancer. How do you get rid of these chemicals when this sort of thing happens? Well, apparently you do a controlled burn. As the New York Times reports, Norfolk Southern conducted the controlled release and burn off of some of the train's chemical cargo, a process that generated a massive, sooty plume of smoke on February 6th, to avoid an explosion that might have caused even more widespread damage, officials said. Governor Mike DeWine, a Republican, signed off on the plan, describing it as the lesser of two evils. Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, a Democrat, also approved it, though he accused Norfolk Southern of mishandling the process and failing to consider other options. The images and video from the disaster have been horrifying, and as someone who doesn't live too far from train tracks, this is genuinely scary. In fact, as I write this video, another train operated by Norfolk Southern has derailed in Springfield, Ohio. Luckily, as of now, no person has died. Though, as I mentioned earlier, prolonged exposure to these chemicals could cause serious health problems. Furthermore, a lot of animals have died, indicating that the chemicals are far from benign. The most significant death from this derailment hasn't been a person or animal, but an ideology. Brianna Joy Gray has declared this the death of libertarianism.
You know, I was joking to you before we started filming today, it feels like the end of libertarianism. Because they're all kind of begging and clamoring, why hasn't the government done more? Why haven't these regulations been in effect? And they're completely right.
The logic goes that since deregulation seems to be the culprit here, companies cannot be trusted to be left to themselves, and therefore libertarianism is a bankrupt ideology. Now, it may well be that deregulation caused this. The online left certainly seems to think so.
Don't let anyone trick you into thinking that this story is about anything other than the fact that both corporate Democrats and corporate Republicans are in cahoots in allowing corporations to get away with little regulation.
And they're certainly not the only ones. I don't have sufficient knowledge of the ins and outs of the US rail industry to give an educated opinion on that matter. But let's say, for the sake of argument, they're correct. Is it the death of libertarianism, and would that be a good thing? To take the questions in reverse order, at the very least, there would be one redeeming quality of libertarianism dying. That would be the likely death of the national embarrassment that is the Libertarian Party, and their horrendous Twitter accounts along with it. As most of you know, I used to call myself a libertarian, but no more. By the way, even when I identified as a libertarian, I still thought the LP was useless and stupid. The change in my label has far more to do with foreign policy than anything else. My views haven't really changed that much. I just didn't appreciate how divergent they were on foreign policy from your average libertarian until Russia invaded Ukraine. After that happened, I concluded that it would be dishonest to continue to use that label to describe myself. That said, I'm still very much sympathetic to the libertarian position on domestic issues, and to that extent, I would mourn its passing. Assuming that deregulation was in fact the culprit here, is it fair to say that this train derailment is the death of libertarianism? Well, again, I don't know the rail industry well, but I do know a thing or two about libertarianism. And contrary to what you might have heard on Tucker Carlson,
in Washington, almost nobody speaks for the majority of voters. You're either a libertarian zealot controlled by the banks, yammering on about entrepreneurship and how we need to cut entitlements. That's one side of the aisle. Or worse, you're some decadent trust fund socialist who wants to ban passenger cars and give Medicaid to illegal aliens. That's the other side.
Libertarians are in fact not influential and do not run one of our major political parties. Their views are pretty divergent from the status quo. For example, if libertarians actually ran this country, we probably wouldn't have the Jones Act, which would make shipping domestically by water a lot easier and a lot less expensive. And given that it's a lot safer than shipping by rail, we would be less likely to have such an accident. Now, is it possible that the rail industry is the one institution in the United States where libertarians got their way? Sure, but I wouldn't deem it likely. So, at the very least, even if deregulation caused this accident, to say it's the death of libertarianism as an ideology is a slight exaggeration. Up to this point, though, I've been beating around the bush. This cannot be the death of libertarianism, because you cannot kill something that's already dead. That's right, libertarianism died a few years ago, specifically in 2020 from COVID-19. At least that's what the previous hosts of Rising, Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty, told me.
But there's one speck of good news that emerged from this crisis, and that is the final and complete death of libertarianism on the right and on the left.
And what replaced the ubiquitous ideology of libertarianism? Populism, of course. Only populism could achieve the twin objectives of defeating the virus while keeping people afloat.
The future of American politics is now one that we advocate for on this show. Hating the elites of the country with everything that we've got, and having both sides fight for the interests of working Americans. Banished forever are those who bemoan taxpayer-funded bailouts to people who are standing on the edge of a cliff at no fault of their own. Their ideology is finally revealed as ridiculous to the very people who it matters most to, the voters.
So, the populists got their way. And how did that work out? Well, we didn't defeat the virus in any meaningful way. It's still around. And the economic effects of lockdowns and efforts to keep people afloat during the lockdowns have not yielded great results either. Inflation is arguably the worst of the problems they've helped create, but it's far from the only one. To be fair to the former Rising hosts, now over at Breaking Points, they were relatively early on the we need to lift restrictions and learn to live with the virus bandwagon, but they have yet to acknowledge that they were wrong on inflation. They've simply come up with scapegoats. And go figure, this whole thing just goes to show that they don't really get libertarianism. Let's listen to why Sagar thinks that libertarianism simply cannot provide solutions for a global pandemic.
We don't ask questions about how we're going to pay for each individual line item of this bailout crisis because we understand that a pandemic is the definition of a problem that affects all of us, and there is no way to personal responsibility or individualism your way out of this one.
The thing is, from a standpoint of problem solving, a pandemic is not unique. There have always been people who suffer through no fault of their own. There have always been externalities of private action that need to be accounted for. There have always been collective action problems. Libertarians do have answers for these that are more than squawking about bootstraps and personal responsibility. You may not agree with these solutions or find them compelling, and there's plenty of disagreements amongst libertarians about what the best approach is to different problems, but it's not like this sort of thing hasn't gone unacknowledged. Here's Kevin D. Williamson, a self-identified libertarian, delivering a lecture on his book, The End is Near, and It's Going to Be Awesome.
They're going to be people who are children. We don't expect children to be responsible for themselves. They're going to be people who are 85 and can no longer do things for themselves. They're going to be people who are disabled. And they're going to be people who are just unlucky. And we are not the sort of society that's going to let people starve to death in the streets or not have health care or not be educated. We're going to go out and do that. We're going to solve those problems. We're going to address those problems. But I think we as libertarians should probably be a little more vocal about the fact that we think these are problems and we want to solve them. That we do think poverty is a problem. We do think that these various other things are problems. Not only do we have solutions, but we have solutions that actually have a pretty good chance of working. I mean, the great indictment of the welfare state isn't that it costs a lot of money, because what's money, right? But it doesn't actually do the thing it's supposed to do.
Most libertarians I know believe that people are quite capable of solving problems without the intervention of government and politics. Rather, they prefer solutions based on voluntary action. At least have the decency and honesty to take them on their own terms, instead of just strawmanning the whole ideology. The biggest failure, in my opinion, that the proponents of lockdowns and support programs have committed is that they really failed to appreciate the scope of what they were trying to do. To think that you can systemically shut down portions of the economy, thus limiting human interaction to ride out the virus, and keep everyone afloat through guaranteed loans and direct cash payments, without there being serious consequences, is a level of hubris that took even me by surprise. The idea that we could get through this whole thing with minimal damage if we just enacted the right plan is the height of arrogance. I'm reminded of this famous line from Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Smith writes, "The man of system, on the contrary, is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely and in all its parts, without any regard either to the great interests or to the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that, in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. If those two principles coincide and act in the same direction, the game of human society will go on easily and harmoniously, and is very likely to be happy and successful. If they are opposite or different, the game will go on miserably, and the society must be at all times in the highest degree of order. The extent to which economic planners think their task of controlling the economy is easy is implicit in their analogies."
You would think that all these years, we would have found out a way to functionally press the pause button on the economy. Like the stock market, you know how the stock market automatically shuts off when it drops too fast? When it looks like there's going to be a run on the banks? Everything just shuts off. So can't we have effectively a pause button for the broader economy where only the essential businesses stay open, all the others are closed, and everybody basically stays home, and then you have the emergency procedures go into effect, the emergency processes go into effect, where, like I said, it's a freeze on the major bills, you get the automatic allowance to pay for the non-essential bills. You know, when I say that, I mean whatever, your food, Netflix, whatever you're doing during this time of crisis, internet, like the major bills should be paused. Certain ones, you know, obviously won't be, but I think that's the only way to really get through this and weather the storm. But unfortunately, what you're seeing is we have no provisions in place to do an effective lockdown.
The economy is not a machine. It's not a ship. It doesn't have a pause button. It's not a car whose engine you can jump when you need to. The economy is the countless transactions and interactions that humans engage in every single day. Everyone who has tried to control it has failed spectacularly. We can't even control the underground economies in our prisons, much less society at large. This was the error populists made, pretending to have knowledge and capabilities they didn't, and it's one that libertarians are unlikely to make. Central planners have come in many forms and exist across the political spectrum. It's usually associated with the political left, but that's a narrow view on things. F.A. Hayek devoted his famous book, The Road to Serfdom, to socialists of all parties, and he wasn't wrong to do so. The thing that always gets me about populists embracing planning is that it seems to fly in the face of one of their core beliefs. They think that average people are intelligent and honest enough to be handed the reins of power and be trusted with determining the direction of society. Take, for example, what Crystal and Sagar said about Anthony Fauci lying to Americans about masks.
The Surgeon General and the U.S. government were saying, don't wear a mask, not because we need these critical supplies for our frontline healthcare workers, which would have been that. Like, yes,
Fine. People
tell
would
us
have
that.
listened.
People would have listened.
If it's true that, when armed with the right information, people will do the right thing, then why do lockdowns need to be enforced by the government? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that stopping the spread was a necessary step to take, and that lockdowns were an effective means of doing so. Couldn't we expect people to start changing their behavior voluntarily? In fact, that's exactly what happened. As Ryan Bourne writes in Economics in One Virus, Cato Institute Executive Vice President David Boaz has pointed out how events such as South by Southwest, March Madness, the Masters Tournament, and the Boston Marathon were all canceled before the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's March 15th recommendation that gatherings of more than 50 people be prohibited. Temporary closures of nationwide chains such as Nike, Urban Outfitters, Lululemon, and Abercrombie & Fitch preceded state orders to close businesses too. Other businesses adjusted how they operated in the face of the public health threat. McDonald's announced that franchises should close dining rooms and offer takeout services only. Starbucks closed some stores and only offered to-go services at those remaining open. Major tech firms had told employees to work from home from the very first days of March. My employer, the Cato Institute, instituted mandatory teleworking 12 days before D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser's non-essential business close went into effect on March 24th. As of writing this, December 2020, there are no plans to reconsider a return to regular office work until spring 2021 at the earliest. In short, overwhelming numbers of businesses and nonprofits embraced radical social distancing in the forms of business premises closures and working from home arrangements before government mandates compelled them to close. Yes, we can find businesses and activities that did not voluntarily close and that would have remained open were it not for government lockdowns. But to a large extent, lockdown regulations, in the form of stay-at-home orders and non-essential business closures, codified changes that had already begun in much of the market sector across the country. That raises an obvious question. Why were businesses and nonprofits closing before governments compelled them to do so? In some cases, it was undoubtedly due to the expectation of government orders to follow, or observation about what happened in China and then Italy. But there's another, simpler explanation. In the face of the public health threat, enough consumers and workers were hesitant about stepping foot in the buildings or commuting into cities where they risked infection. Those businesses affected, faced with collapsing demand and nervous workforces, saw it was no longer profitable or good staff morale to keep the premises open. Many people were inevitably going to change their behavior in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Probably not as many as would have under forced government lockdowns, but it likely would have been considerable all the same. The initial goal of the lockdowns was perfectly laudable. Slow the spread so that we don't overwhelm the hospital system with sick patients. It's also perfectly desirable not to get COVID-19. The vast majority of people survive, but it's still not fun. How well we could have accomplished these goals without mandated lockdowns versus with mandated lockdowns is a counterfactual that we can never truly know. People can build models and make projections, but those are crude approximations at best. And that's kind of the point. No one can know the effects of a given action on the whole of society, which is one of the reasons why I oppose social engineering of this sort, including sweeping mandatory lockdowns. Whatever else is true of the lockdowns, we know that they did come with serious trade-offs. Even if we forget all the people and businesses who ran out of cash, we can see that there was some serious suffering associated with lockdowns. People gained weight, deaths of despair and overdoses rose, self-reported rates of stress and depression increased, and so on. Again, some of this was inevitable as some people were going to naturally change their behavior even without mandatory lockdowns. But if you insist on arguing that mandatory lockdowns were effective at slowing the spread of the coronavirus, which I'm certainly not conceding, then it's not a stretch to think that the negative side effects of lockdowns would have been worse also. What I do know is that people are far better at assessing which trade-offs are worth taking than our government bureaucrats who don't even know them. Unlike populists, I believe you're quite capable of making your own decisions.